Every year, the tight end position proves to be a black hole from which no one can ever escape and all fantasy seasons go to die. It turns out that the guy you selected in the third round isn't as good as some guy your aunt picked up off the waiver wire who ends up outscoring your guy by 70 points over the course of a season. And you're just left wondering, wow, I could have done something better with that third round pick. But the thing is, despite how much the tight end position might suck, you still have to draft one at the end of the day. So what can we do to try and recognize who the good tight ends are in this year's draft? I've compiled a list of 5 rules as to how I think you should approach the tight end position going into this year. And if you follow my rules, I'm pretty confident that you'll walk out of the draft with at least a guy who you feel pretty comfortable putting in your lineup. First rule for drafting a tight end is if you want to get a good tight end who's going to give you guaranteed production, go big or go home. On the screen, I have a list of the top 8 tight ends this year based on consensus rankings. And if you look at the top 2 guys, Trey McBride and Brock Bowers, you can see that there is a pretty significant point difference separating them from even guys 3 and 4. There is a 50-point difference between tight end 1 and 4, and there's a 20-point difference between tight end 2 and 3. And we just don't see this kind of top heaviness in any other position in fantasy football. Even with quarterbacks, where you have the elite rushing guys at the top, there's still a couple of them. You've got Lamar Jackson, you've got Josh Allen, you've got Jaden Daniels, you've got Jalen Hurts sometimes, and you've got Joe Burrow kind of mixing in seasons where he throws 40 touchdowns and is almost a rushing quarterback. But in the tight end position, there is such a wide difference between the top 2 guys who basically play receiver and everyone else who is more of the traditional tight end. And because of that, if you don't want to worry about tight end, you don't want to be the person scouring the waiver wire every week looking for just anybody who can give you a smidgen of hope that your tight end spot is not going to be the hole in your ship sinking you, just draft Trey McBride or Brock Bowers. Now, to be fair, the go big part of the going home part is these guys are both second-round picks. If you draft Trey McBride or Brock Bowers, you're sacrificing a significant asset at either wide receiver or running back. However, if you're feeling confident in your fantasy projections and your ability to pick up valuable players in the later rounds, I see no reason why you cannot build a winning fantasy roster around a tight end in the second round plus whoever your first round pick is. These guys just provide such a huge positional advantage compared to everyone else, where you just have a guy who can score, has such a higher ceiling in what he can score compared to someone else in the tight end position. And that gives you a huge advantage week to week, and especially a huge advantage when you're going up against another team who's good, where it might come down to the fact that Brock Bowers scored 16 points for you that week, and someone like they're starting Dalton Kincaid, and he scored 8 points. And because of that, I think that there is extreme value in getting one of these elite guys. And I also think that you look at these points I talked about earlier, Trey McBride projected 240, Brock Bowers projected 234. Both of these projections are based on the fact that neither of them is going to get to 1,000 yards. I think Brock Bowers is penciled in for 1,000 yards. He is clearly the wide receiver 1, or the number 1 receiving option in the Raiders offense. And yeah, I know they're going to run the ball with Ashton Jeanty, but I think Brock Bowers is a lock for 1,000 yards plus 8+ touchdowns. I think both of these guys have a chance to score more points than they're projected to. And if they do, I think they could blow past. That would just push them higher up in terms of the advantage they provide. So, it is a concept of how you want to strategize for your draft, but if you want guaranteed tight end production and you don't want to have to worry about all the stuff I'm going to talk about in the rest of this video, just draft Trey McBride or Brock Bowers. Between the two, I give a slight edge to Brock Bowers just because I think he has less target competition and better quarterback play, because somehow Kirk Cousins and Fernando Mendoza sound better to me than Jacoby Brissett. But I think they're both elite options at the end of the day. The next rule is less of a rule and more something to keep in mind as you progress through your fantasy draft. When it comes to the first 2 guys, Trey McBride and Brock Bowers, they offer such elite positional upside that it's worth fading other positions, other elite players, to go and get them. However, when it comes to the next 2 guys, Colston Loveland and Tyler Warren, who I think form their own tier right after Trey McBride and Brock Bowers, I think that you have to be at least aware of the fact that when you pick one of these guys, you are giving up on elite fantasy talent to go and get them. And I think that's a little bit scary, at least for me, because I have nagging doubts about each one of these guys going into this season. That compared to the top two guys, I don't think they're bona fide guaranteed studs. They're going to be good. They're going to be tight end ones. The problem is, if they're not absolutely elite and providing that positional advantage compared to a team with a lesser tight end, they're not worth the draft capital you have to go spend to get them, especially when that draft capital could go to a player who is far and above players going behind them. The thing about Colston Loveland is that he is in a very contested receiving core with Rome Odunze and Luther Burden, and I'm worried about Caleb Williams' ability to produce enough for at least two of them to be fantasy relevant consistently, given that he's never thrown 4,000 yards and has consistency problems throwing the football. And as for Tyler Warren, he doesn't have as much competition. There is a little bit in Josh Downs and Alex Pierce, but his quarterback's coming back from an an Achilles rupture, and Daniel Jones has not always been the most elite quarterback. So with both of these guys, I have concerns that keep me a little on edge when I think about drafting them. And the thing about that is you need to land your third and fourth round picks. And Colston Loveland's a third round pick. Tyler Warren's a fourth round pick. And I know a lot of people like to talk about how you need to land your first two draft picks. If you miss one of your first two draft picks, your season gets a lot harder. You also need to land, really rounds 1 through 4 is where you make or break your draft. Yeah, sometimes you'll get a sleeper later in drafts where it, elevates your team beyond everyone else and leads you to winning the championship, because this guy was just so much better than anyone could have imagined back in August when the drafts happened. But a lot of the time, the team that wins the fantasy championship just nails the first 4 rounds. And looking at the guys going around Colston Loveland and Tyler Warren, I have concerns about if these guys falter or they fall short of expectations, you passed up on some significant draft capital to go get them. You look at the guys going around Colston Loveland, Ladd McConkey should be stepping into a tight end 1 role on an elite football team with a new offensive coordinator we love. Emeka Egbuka, second-year rookie, primed to break out now that he's off an injury and his quarterback isn't injured. Derrick Henry, all-time great player. Javonte Williams has absolutely no backfield competition. All of those guys are elite players, and then let's say you do take Colston Loveland, you decide that he's just so much better, provides such a great positional advantage, you have to fade all these other guys. If you go into the next round, Tyler Warren is about in a 12-team league a round after Colston Loveland. If you look at the guys who are now available at their positions, Mike Evans has injury concerns compared to guys like Ladd McConkey and Emeka Egbuka. DJ Moore, not the same caliber of player as a guy like Ladd McConkey or Emeka Egbuka. Rome Odunze, target competition more significant than Ladd McConkey and Emeka Egbuka. David Montgomery has O-line questions and offensive questions that aren't present with Derrick Henry and Javonte Williams. So if you take Colston Loveland, all of a sudden, when the next round comes around, you're looking at guys who are, I know obviously they're a tier below them, but I think that they're significantly below them. And the same thing goes if you take Tyler Warren and fade the guys around him. Come around the next round, you're looking at DeAndre Swift, might lose his job to Kyle Monangai. Carnell Tate, rookie wide receiver in a bad offense. Marvin Harrison Jr., never been able to put it together. Jaylen Warren, just not that good at football. DK Metcalf, also not that good at football. So I think that with Tyler Warren and Colston Loveland, it's very important to be knowledgeable about the potential risks associated with drafting them and the situations that could lead to them not returning value. And I just think that it's important that you're very confident that I think Colston Loveland is going to have 900 yards and double-digit touchdowns this season. Or I think Tyler Warren's going to have that stat line too. Because if you think for a second that there's a chance that Daniel Jones or Caleb Williams, they aren't able to maintain an offense that leads to this kind of production for them, I wouldn't draft these guys just because I'm concerned that they're not going to return the same type of value just overall on a fantasy roster compared to the guys going around them, even if they provide relative positional value, and Colston Loveland's the tight end, 5 by 25 points compared to the guy after him, or Tyler Warren's the tight end 6, leading ahead of the tight end 7 by 35 points. Even if that's the case, I don't know if that provides the same amount of week-to-week value on your fantasy team as a guy like Emeka Egbuka being a clear low-end wide receiver 1 does. So just something to be aware of if you take these guys with, those questions that might bring them down, you're giving up a lot of value at other positions. All right, the next rule is absolutely a rule, and that is we are fading mid-round tight ends at their ADP. The reason for this is that once you get past those top 4 guys, you start to get into a bunch of guys who aren't necessarily better or worse than anyone going behind them. And what I mean by that is you start getting into guys who, if you look at their points per game from last year, except for the 2 outliers who I'm going to talk about later in a second, they're all kind of around each other. They're all hovering around 11 points or 12 points a game, and none of them are really any worse or better than them. These are all guys who are doing the boom-bust tight end thing, where they'll have a week where they score 16, a week where they score 6, and it averages out to about 10 points, and everyone goes on with their lives. So that's not super helpful for fantasy, because basically what that means is you never know what you're going to get out of your tight end spot. You might have a week where you really need your tight end spot to do something for you, and it shits the bed, and then next week where, one of your other players goes off by 40 and you win your week by 50, your tight end also goes off for 25, and now you just win your week by 75. So what we're really looking for with a tight end, in my opinion, is someone who's going to be consistently putting up points and who you can just rely on to put up decent points every week, and you don't have to worry about them being the reason you lose a week. And the problem with all of these guys is you can never rely on them to put up consistent fantasy numbers, because they all have serious questions that I think are going to prevent them from being consistent fantasy producers and from being a guy who you really want to have on your team. And yes, some of these guys are going to be the tight end ones. They're going to be the guys who, when you look back at the end of the season, are the guys that theoretically should be on every team. But there are going to be guys who are much more consistent, guys who have much more upside at a cheaper value, because remember, all of these guys are going between pick 70 and 115. That's, still, that is like the mid-range where things start to get a little gross in the other positions, but there's still valuable players to be had here, and I don't think that these guys are worth their value for the fact that there are other guys later who you can take dart throws at, who may provide more value, but are a little riskier. But looking at these guys, Harold Fannin Jr., bad quarterback play. Shedeur Sanders and Deshaun Watson are bad. They drafted a bunch of receivers this year. I just worry that he's going to see more target competition than he did last year, where it was only him and Jerry Jeudy and Jerry Jeudy's ass in the Browns offense this year. And I don't know if Shedeur Sanders and Deshaun Watson can support that, can literally support Harold Fannin plus anyone else being relevant. So I don't really like him. Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts is bad. Do not draft Kyle Pitts. Sam Laporta. He's the third option on his team. You never want to draft a tight end who's not at least the second option on his team. I like Sam Laporta, the player. I don't like Sam Laporta, the fantasy player, because I just think he's always behind Jameson Williams, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and sometimes behind Jahmyr Gibbs, who also has pass catching upside as a running back. Travis Kelce, he's just old. He's just old. I don't want him. He's old. He's going through the twilight of his career. He's going through the motions. There's no upside left there. Jake Ferguson, he's behind 2 elite receivers. He's not going to get the ball that often. He was kind of good last year, but when you look at when he was good, it was when one of the receivers was out. He's only probably going to be fantasy relevant if one of the receivers goes out. And then Dalton Kincaid, not only has Dalton Kincaid not separated himself out in the receiving core, he can't consistently keep Dawson Knox off the field. Dawson Knox goes on the field way more than you want as a Dalton Kincaid owner. I'm out. I'm done with Dalton Kincaid. However, there's 2 guys in this range, Tucker Kraft and George Kittle, who I don't want to say they're going to be a smash hit, but who I will take every once in a while in a draft. The reason, though, that I'm a little iffy on them is, as you can see, they're both coming off injury. They both, Tucker Kraft had an ACL injury, George Kittle had an Achilles injury, and they're both projected to be ready week 1. The question just is, how ready are they going to be week 1? And are they going to be 100% at some point this season? Because whenever a player gets injured, especially a player like George Kittle, who's old, less for someone like Tucker Kraft, but for George Kittle, when you're an older player, there is a chance that the injury impacts you more. You go longer before you're 100% again. And if George Kittle isn't 100% until week 10, and you're dealing with the middling tight end production of the guys going around him, he's just going to be in the same boat as them. So with George Kittle and Tucker Kraft, I think that they are reasonable fantasy picks. Tucker Kraft is a little expensive. I always pause a little bit at that. He's going in the 6th round in a 12-team league, but I do think that he will, because of his younger age, he'll be able to bounce back pretty quick. And I think that if he gets 100% healthy by, a couple weeks into the season, he's going to be the clear number 1, most consistent targeted guy in this Packers offense now that they've slimmed down the receiving core. I think there's a very good chance he could replicate his 15 points per game from last year. I like Tucker Kraft. And if that happens, I would love Tucker Kraft. George Kittle, I think a lot of the heavy work for me for George Kittle is his ADP. It's really low, 106. If George Kittle can come back and do anything close to what he was doing last year, it would be a great value to get George Kittle in like the 9th round. So if he is able to come back and do that, I think this could go down as one of the biggest steals in the draft. But if George Kittle, because of that advanced age, because of the injury, comes back slower or isn't able to reclaim as many targets from the other receivers in the 49ers offense, might not be that great of a pick. I do think that because of the ADP, there is some value to be had with George Kittle. The last major rule is look for late round opportunity. What I mean by this is this year and almost every year, there are guys who go in the late round at the tight end position who provide disproportionate value at their position compared to the wide receivers and running backs going around them. Tight end is a position where you don't have to do a lot to be fantasy relevant. If you catch 4 passes a game for 50 yards every week, you're going to be a starting tight end in a league. That's just how the tight end position works, because there's not that many guys who have a lot of production. So there's guys at the end of these drafts who may end up being elite tight end options. The question is, who? I've compiled a list of 7 guys who I think have reasons to be optimistic for them this season. There are questions. There's a reason they're going this late. There is downside. However, I think that there's reason to be optimistic. You just have to decide which guys you think have the best chance of succeeding. First guy is Isaiah Likely. He's tight end for the New York Giants. The reason to draft him would be the high amount of target opportunity in the Giants offense. They don't have a lot of good receiving weapons. The only one they do have is Malik Nabers, but he's injured and may miss part of the opening to the season. We've seen a lot of talent out of Isaiah Likely. A lot of people have wanted him to emerge for a long time when he was on the Ravens. Wasn't able to do it because he was behind an all-time great tight end in Mark Andrews. But now, on a different team, with a coach in John Harbaugh who has shown a lot of belief in him, because he was also the coach of the Ravens before this year, I think that if Malik Nabers is to miss time, Isaiah Likely is a great pick, and even if he doesn't, I do think that there is opportunity for Isaiah Likely to become the clear number 2 in this offense, which would be very fruitful. The downside, though, with Isaiah Likely is he wasn't able to surpass Mark Andrews previously. He may be unable to separate himself out from other Giants tight ends like Theo Johnson, and if he doesn't clearly win out as the number 2, probably not going to be a consistent fantasy starter. The next guy is Dallas Goedert, the Philadelphia Eagles starting tight end. He just has high touchdown upside. Some of these guys in the later rounds, like Mark Andrews, they catch a lot of touchdowns. In the red zone, tight ends are very often targeted. So Dallas Goedert had 11 touchdowns last year. And if he reps out another 10 touchdown season with Jalen Hurts just chucking him the ball in the red zone, he'll probably be a top 10 tight end, and a guy who you might have a couple bust weeks, but if he catches 11 touchdowns, again, that's 11 weeks where he's scoring at least, in PPR, probably 8 points minimum off of a single catch, and that's enough for the tight end position. The reason to fade him, though, would be that this offseason, the Eagles drafted both a tight end and a wide receiver. The tight end is going to obviously provide competition for Dallas Goedert, especially since he's a receiving tight end and not a blocking tight end. And the receiver they drafted is a slot wide receiver traditionally, so he may take those quick, short routes away from Dallas Goedert. But touchdown upside might be enough to propel Dallas Goedert to fantasy relevance. Everything I said for Dallas Goedert is basically the same thing for Mark Andrews. His quarterback, Lamar Jackson, loves him, looks for him in the red zone. Andrews is projected on a lot of betting sites to have the third most touchdowns out of any tight end behind Brock Bowers and Trey McBride. The only downside for Mark Andrews is he's old, and we've seen him decline over the past couple of years. But again, if he catches double-digit touchdowns, he would be fantasy relevant. And the Ravens got rid of Isaiah Likely, the guy I talked about earlier, this offseason, so now Mark Andrews doesn't have to deal with him. So that is another upside. Next guy is Brenton Strange. The reason to draft him is just Trevor Lawrence seems to like him. Liam Cohen, the Jaguars head coach, seems to like Brenton Strange. He was pretty good last year before he got injured, and he was even pretty good when he came back from injury. The only cause for concern is just that the Jaguars have a lot of pass catchers going on. They've got Jacoby Myers, Travis Hunter, Parker Washington, Brian Thomas, all theoretically vying for targets, and that may just keep Brenton Strange from being fantasy relevant. Chig Okonkwo is another guy who, like Isaiah Likely, moved teams this offseason. He's now in the Washington Commanders, and the Commanders, I don't know if people remember this, 2 years ago, Jayden Daniels loved throwing the ball to Zach Ertz, and Zach Ertz was an extremely productive tight end. He was a guy who we were very happy starting at the tight end position, and he was another guy who, sort of like Chig Okonkwo, was just chilling at the bottom of drafts. Do I think Chig Okonkwo can just slot into the Zach Ertz role and do the same thing Zach Ertz did 2 years ago? I think it's a possibility. Now, he's previously failed to show his ability to do this, but I think that new team, lack of target competition, better quarterback, it could happen. Next guy, and a guy who I'm a little more shaky on than the others, is Hunter Henry. The main reason you're just drafting him is because Drake May seemed to like him last year. He threw him the ball a lot, led him to a tight end one finish. He got a bunch of touchdowns. I think the only thing about Hunter Henry is just you have to recognize that Hunter Henry, compared to the other guys on this list, I think is going to have a lower upside. I don't think he's going to separate himself out as a clear weapon. I don't think he's going to become a clear number 2 in this offense. I think he's always going to be hanging around with Romeo Doubs and Demario Douglas as just good secondary weapons behind A.J. Brown. But like I said, as a tight end, you don't have to do as much as a wide receiver to be fantasy relevant. So Hunter Henry could be something there. Last guy, and this is, I want to make it very clear, this is the last guy. This is the dartiest of dart throws, the most desperate of Hail Marys, no Ryan Gosling. Greg Dulcich. He's on the Miami Dolphins, and if you don't know anything about the Miami Dolphins, all you need to know is they have literally no established pass catchers. They are running a pass catching core of guys who have spent their entire career as wide receiver 2s and 3s. So that inevitably leads to the fact that there is going to be opportunity here. The question is, will Greg Dulcich be that guy? The news coming out of camp is that Malik Willis seems to really like Greg Dulcich. They're throwing his name around a lot out of Miami Dolphins training camp. Could just be camp talk. It could just be he's just the guy who's looking great without pads on, but the second they're out there in a game, Malik Willis is running for his life, throwing, 40 yards a game, and the Miami Dolphins look like shit, and Greg Dulcich is averaging 4 points a game. Like, that's entirely possible. Greg Dulcich has never been a consistent fantasy weapon. He's never even been relevant. He's never been a guy who you were starting or rostering. So, he's a guy who, if you're going to draft him, you draft him with another one of these guys. And I forgot to mention this. That goes with a lot of these guys, is I think it's a great idea to take 2 of them. Like, because these guys are all going outside of the top 125, there's no reason, just take 2 of them. Take Isaiah Likely and double back with Hunter Henry later. Take Brenton Strange and Chig Okonkwo. And if one of them, that way you have 2 shots at the dartboard, and hey, you might hit 20 with one of them. So I think that these are the guys who I wouldn't be surprised if they break out and become a consistent fantasy tight end. You got to remember, at the end of the day, these are all guys who have significant questions or drawbacks, and none of that, they all might end up being just as mid and inconsistent as the guys I said not to draft. All right, the last rule, and it's more of just a general motto that can apply to a lot of fantasy football positions, is when it comes to tight end, play the board. During the draft, there's going to be players who get taken way too early, and there's also going to be players who slide 5 picks around 2 rounds. And when it comes to tight end, where a lot of time people only roster a single starting tight end, that leaves often tight ends on the board who slide way past their ADP. And that provides a lot of opportunity for you to get good value. Going back to those guys who I spent, 6-7 minutes shitting on, if they slide around, if Sam Laporta slides around, if Travis Kelce slides around, they start to look a lot sexier as picks. And because at the end of the day, fantasy football is all about value. It's all about getting as much points as you can for the least amount of draft capital spent. So if these guys start sliding down the board, even these players who I've pointed out clear downside cases for or clear reasons to be concerned, they start to become a lot better when you're able to spend earlier picks on better fantasy players and then just scoop this guy up late as sort of my roster's super solid. All these other guys are going to be the league winners. I just need this guy to put up bare minimum production on a weekly basis to keep the tight end position filled. And if you can get a Sam Laporta in round 8, insane value. If you can get a Travis Kelce in round 10, insane value. And if stuff like that happens, then I don't think there's any reason not to take these guys, because at the end of the day, all the guys who I've listed in this video are still pretty decent football players who will provide value to your fantasy team at the right price, except for Kyle Pitts. He's bad. Do not draft Kyle Pitts. So just this last note is just, sometimes you just gotta get in the draft, and even when you have these preconceived notions about who these players are or whether or not you like them at their value, if they slide, jump on it. Because every player has an ADP where they're a good pick. You just have to be able to recognize when that ADP is. So with that is my overview of how to draft a tight end in 2026. I wish you the best of luck, and as a final note, reminder, don't draft Kyle Pitts.